Hi, it's Colleen Schmidt once again from Divination Counseling Service. Once again, I'm going to do something a bit different. And we're going to look at not just astrology facts, but I'm going to give us a preview of all of the astrological, well, not all of them, but many of the really big hitters that we're going to be experiencing in March of this year. I'm so excited about all of this transition that I couldn't wait to get on here and tell you about it. But before I get to that, I do want to explain why I haven't been on for a while is because I'm having some problems with my computer. And this Mars retrograde, which we're going to talk about in this video, has been horrendous for me. And as a result of that, there is no way I will replace that desktop computer before, let me tell you the exact date, before March. Well, I really am waiting until the end of March because there's so many things going on. But we have three things hanging. I think it's March 15th. So if I'm going to go to March 15th, I might as well wait for the rest of the hits to happen in that month, which is only one more after that, which would be on the 23rd, which would be when Pluto moves into Aquarius. I have been so affected by this that I lost two of my USB ports on my main computer, which I can't use it now for this work because I would either lose my mouse or I would lose my keyboard. So I had to pull the laptop out for this one, which to me, the chart portion, which I'll show you in a minute, isn't as good as when I'm on the computer, the big computer. But unfortunately, I can't do that for several months, which means that not only is this preview going to be from the laptop, but no doubt so will the remaining aspects of what I'd like to talk about in March. So I did want to apologize for that. It's been horrendous for me and for many other people out there, and I'm sure you know who you are. For some reason, oh, I know what the reason is. We had and I'm going to get to that right now, we had a Mars retrograde running through the sign of Gemini. And generally speaking, Mars retrogrades do not act like Mercury retrogrades. Yes, we want to be careful of certain things when there's a Mars retrograde going on, and we do want to pay attention to it's when it begins and when it comes out of its shadow, which I'll talk about in a moment. That tends to be much more important in a Mercury retrograde because it lasts 3 weeks and then you have a 3-week shadow period. Mars, we don't like to talk about the shadow period quite as much, although a lot of things can happen on those stations and those shadow periods. But now you're talking about something that lasts 6 weeks, and then the shadow will last 6 weeks, and then you're talking about 3 months. So I think it's really important for us to kind of chat about that, because I don't think that all of us are alerted to just really how important this particular Mars retrograde really was and still is until it's finally completed its shadow period, March 15th of 2023. I wanted to talk about that, and we will. I also want to talk about a couple of other things that come up in astrology discussions. I have recently been back in touch with another astrologer, which has been absolutely wonderful, and going through some work that I haven't done since the 90s. Kind of ashamed to say, I use the Uranian technique all the time. I actually show it in part to you when we switch charts from wheels to dials. But one of the things that I have always wanted to learn is the house system, which is rather complicated, has a mirroring quality. It's wonderful. The problem with me, and I have some learning disability, although I'm good with this kind of stuff. I'm actually good with a learning disability because I really do think that sometimes we need to go through things more than once in order to learn them, for real. And so I'm going through the Uranian house system for perhaps maybe the third or fourth time. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I think it's really important that when you understand a technique, such as the Uranian house system, that you really, really understand it. So when I get it, and hopefully I get it, I'll probably do videos on it, because one of the things about me is as soon as I learn something, it's really good for me to teach it. So we'll get to that. In our conversations with other astrologers, and not so much in the groups I belong to now, but in the initial groups that I was really involved in, particularly going back to the 90s, we spent a lot of time talking about astrology ethics. And I think it's something that every now and then we should all remind ourselves of. Let me give you an example. I've been an astrologer for a very, very long time. I've been a professional astrologer for decades. And one of the things that I can honestly tell you, and you can ask any of my clientele, I will never do a chart for somebody that I do not have permission for, or that they're not a part of public domain. But even if they're a part of public domain, I don't want to step all over their Atlantis. And when I say that, I mean those things within themselves that they don't want to have out in public, that are private. And there's a betrayal when you start getting into other people's private information, particularly when you do not have their permission. Now, some people, I'm also an offender of this. If I start dating someone, now, I've done this for a really long time. I've been with the same person for 15 years now, and prior to that I had a 20-year relationship. So I'm not somebody who really does that, but I don't frown on that as much, because I feel like, I know when I looked at the present partner's chart, I didn't have the time. So it wasn't like I was really able to dig in, and I was only able to dig in enough to know whether or not this was worthwhile wasting my time on. And that's okay, all right? That's okay to do. I also feel doing corporate charts and charts that are of entities that are more corporate, business, or craft related, even art, that's fine, fair game, because they're here for us. But and I think people are here for us too, but I think we need to respect people. And that's why I think ethics in astrology becomes very, very important. I also have noticed that the higher the level of the astrologer, the more they're probably not going to engage you in something that they may not agree on. This is true of me, but it's also true of other people at a higher level. They're not going to get on there and say, look, you're wrong. That's not how that's interpreted. That's not a good learning mechanism. And as somebody who's been a teacher for decades, well, all of my life, really, there's nothing that I do in my life that I haven't taught. So as a result, I would say that that's pointless. There's nothing to be gained. That's just causing division and arguments, and there's nothing to be gained. If you don't agree, or if you feel that the information is really off, don't follow the astrologer. Just don't argue. The other part of it is, and in the age where, and I am myself very concerned about disinformation, even in my own field, I do not want my work, the work of an astrologer, any work that's related to astrology, to go out there with false information. That, however, doesn't happen much, because when an astrologer looks at a planet, they see that planet for what it is. However, they will not always agree on the manifestation of that particular energy in a person's life. I could give you examples, but I really, that's towing the line for me as well. There have been examples that I've seen recently of specific political, and by the way, politics, you know, they're open. Again, I wouldn't trample on their personal stuff as much, but I might a little bit, because they are our lawmakers, and we should know a little bit about them. We should have actually known about them before we voted. So I read something recently about a particular politician, and I saw what the astrologer was talking about. And I can actually agree with some of it. I cannot agree with the outcome, but I'm not going to argue. I would let history in this particular case speak for itself. So astrology ethics is really, really important because astrologers are professionals and they are scientists. Even though some people out there don't understand how this is a science, it is not only a science, it's a science with a high integrity score. So it's a good science. And I think that what makes it a little bit borderline might be some of the errors or misinterpretations, or in the case of the particular person I'm not agreeing with at all. I think that we see the planets very similarly. We just don't see how that person would, in this case, abuse that power. See, one of the things that we have to understand as astrologers is there is no good, there is no bad, there only is what is. Okay? So we don't want to put judgments on things because that doesn't gel with astrology. I can't go and say, oh, you're wrong, you know? I could have, but I wouldn't. It's unprofessional. And I think that professionalism is very, very important to everything that we do. And so for some people, that'll mean the essence of being politically correct. Well, is it so bad to have manners and not want to offend people? Is it so bad not to want to create arguments? Because honestly, and I've said this for many, many years, if something is wrong, as I disagree with this particular person, I'm not going to have to say that I disagree because ultimately they wrote it, it's out there in public, and when history plays itself out, which it's already doing, this might not look so good for this particular astrologer. It would not behoove me to get involved in the flame war. And that's a huge ethics violation because this person is a professional and I do respect their work most of the time. I don't this particular article, but that doesn't mean that it devalues them. So moving on with our astrology ethics. Astrology ethics is also how much do I tell a client? Do I tell them about death if you see death? Well, the irony is in astrology, many things mean death. So good luck. Also, we die deaths every day. Okay. You go to bed at night. You wake up in the morning. Okay. So what do I say to that? I say to that as an experienced card reader, as an astrologer, it's easy to explain that there's an end of a cycle or beginning of a cycle. We're all going to experience it when Pluto moves into Aquarius on March 23rd at 8:35 or something like that in the morning. We are all going to experience the transformation of one sign to another. So death is tough to predict. Somebody always talks about Donna Cunningham, worst prediction she ever made. By the way, a fabulous astrologer. I own her books. I do not think she's with us any longer, but she predicted her own death based on Pluto, which is easy to do, and she didn't die. So again, I think that when it comes to astrology, death comes in all kinds of forms, and it's difficult. Now, as a card reader, I have seen death. I remember reading for somebody, and at that very moment, I saw somebody passing. It was in her cards, but I could also feel it. And I said it was somebody close, and she gets home to find out, it was a few hours, I think, that she found out, it was literally, though, only hours, so it was very quick, that her ex-husband had committed suicide. Another instance, I read for a man who had AIDS and had been given last rites numerous times. And he really wanted to die. He was suffering terribly. And I had to tell him the truth that he couldn't die until he finished something, which he did, which fortunately did happen, and he was able to die with that and everything clear. But yes, you can see death, because death is really the big journey. And I guess that what it comes down to is death is not the end, but an end only in terms of a new beginning. And that I always like sharing this too, that when my father passed away, he had really strong Jupiter transits, which is, by the way, very common. I had tried to do some incubation to see if I could ever contact with him on the other side. It took a minute, it took a while. He was always laughing. He was always laughing. Finally, yes, there was some contact after. But the reality is that Jupiter is one of the really biggest indicators. And ironically, it's not something that a lot of people would associate with death. So I do like to mention that. The last thing I want to talk about before I start showing off some of these charts that I will be getting into within more detail, with the exception of the Mars. I don't know that I'll be going back through that Mars, but I did want to show people how to look for things. Let the chart speak for itself. I'm an asteroid astrologer. I work with 22,000 whatever asteroids, named asteroids. I create smaller lists. You're never working with that many at a time. You'd go crazy. But my teacher's famous words, and my teacher is Martha Lang Westcott, and she has her own site, still walking with us, thankfully, and has so much to offer. But she actually has made the statement, believe the chart, as one of her mottos. Believe what you see. Believe it. And I can tell you that after all these decades of doing astrology, believe the chart. Or as another astrologer, in something that I read earlier today, said, let the chart speak for itself. So don't you try to hover over a chart. I kind of think that's what happened with the other astrologer that I didn't agree with the outcome. I think that he was really into the aspect itself, which is a big aspect. I understand. I get it, But I think that we all forget that there is no good or bad, or that you can't, when you're on it, when you have an aspect, the trajectory of that aspect is such that it's up to your free will. Do you use it for good or for not so good? Again, what is your soul's life purpose, okay? And how does that particular aspect relate to you? This is so important because my daughter pointed this out to me recently. A lot of people, especially when you're beginning astrology, think, oh, the trines, we got all these trines, yay. And I'm going to tell you what Martha says about trines. It's one planet lying about something and the other's just going along with it. So it doesn't necessarily always mean it's good. My daughter realized that because it gave credence to something that wasn't so good. She says, oh, so that just makes it easy for me to, in this case, get angry. Yeah, it does. So the reality is that your chart is a lot of potential, whether it's a chart of an event, a chart of a person, but how that energy is going to be utilized is completely up to the individual. And that as astrologers, and this astrologer in particular, I always try to advise what I call the higher road, or decisions made by the honorable man. I always say that. Those are my favorite sayings. Taking high roads, making judgments that are honorable, that take the high road. That's, just me as a person. It fits my chart to be like that. But for the next person, there may be something that has to do with their life destiny. Putin is a good example. Can't even believe there's Libra in that chart, but there really is, okay? Here's somebody who really feels that his life purpose is to put Russia back to where it was in its heyday. Now, you and I know that ages and zeitgeists change, and that even though life is a cycle, it's not a circle, it's a spiral, so that nothing is as it was. It can't be, because even as we come around to our own Saturn returns, okay, approximately 30, some people a little before, some a little after, approximately 60, some a little before, some a little after, 90, some a little before, some a little after. Okay, each one of those Saturn returns is not going to act like the first one. That's impossible. Okay, that's true of everything in life. And it's up to us to understand that. So, enough of the lecture. Now what I'd like to do is I'm going to point out just some charts. We're going to look at, first of all, I want to do all the Mars stuff. So we're going to look at Mars as it went retrograde. We're going to look again at Mars as it comes out of retrograde. So let me give you those dates. I have the charts already done. Mars went direct at 8 degrees. That was on January 12th. That's when it went direct. It actually retrograde. Let me go back to the retrograde. I should do this in order. The retrograde actually happened October 30th of 22. It actually went direct, and that was at 25 degrees 36 minutes. Okay, so it's stationed at that point, meaning it kind of stopped. Okay, it's an optical illusion. These things never stop. It's just that some things move faster and then it looks like they're not moving, but it's just ridiculous. But anyway, it's all optical illusion. The problem is that stinking optical illusion really can affect us, which it just blows my mind sometimes when I think about stuff like that. So, so basically Mars direct is just happened, all right? And I'm going to be honest with you, it's a very important part of Putin's chart, by the way. I believe that might have something to do with his Mars. So I'm not sure if it's his Mars. I just heard there's a whole bunch of astrologers talking on the political list that I belong to, and they really that is a very important point. It's just if anybody wants to look that up. The Mars direct and the retrograde are two very important charts. And then I'm going to show you a third chart, which is the day that Mars would be officially out of that shadow, which again does not happen till March. And I'm going to be really honest when I say this. There are a lot of retrogrades with Mars that, some people feel more intently than others. But I think this particular Mars retrograde being in Gemini, I think stymied people, and I think a lot of people will not see the light of day on this until Mars is out of its shadow. Okay, so let's go and look at these charts. I do plan to go through this rather quickly. I just wanted to show you, and I'm only going to show you charts rather than dials, although we could take a peek at a dial. But here's the day of October. Oh, you can't see that. This is October 30th of 2022. You can't see it because my picture is over your information. But you can see here that, and we'll look for it, Mars has stationed. Now it's really, let's talk about this, okay? In this particular chart, it's the 7th house. That is also going to be true for the government. Okay, so I did use where I live, but I'll really be honest with you, I live literally about an hour and a half, give or take, out of DC. So I don't live far from DC. People around me actually go to DC often. I have a friend whose daughter lives in DC, and it's really easy to go visit her. So I live on the East Coast in that whole metropolitan mess. And fortunately for me, I am outside of the DC mess for about 90 minutes. Anyway, you'll see this here, okay? And this is a couple of points I want to make about this. This is not only the sign of Mercury, okay? But it is also in the placement of enemies. 7th house is open enemies. 12th house is hidden enemies. So it's the house of open enemies. And I don't need to say that a lot is going on in the United States. I don't need to say that. I don't need to say that we're coming into some really critical times. Some indictments will be going out. Somebody was just arrested at the airport. The espionage, treason kind of elements are part of our vocabulary at the moment. Although it's not. It's only part of the vocabulary of the people that are following that story. Unfortunately, here in the United States, the mainstream media tends to get stuck on certain subject matters, and they don't always pick up the good stories. So it's up to us to follow them on the internet. I've been doing it. So we had this guy get arrested at the airport, and I believe he's going to sing like a Tweety bird. So we could find many things out till then. So I did want to point that out. I mean, a couple of things you could do here would be to go to Mars, and not the sorted one, let's go to the real list, okay? And you could look at Mars and look at, well, first of all, there's a couple of trines here that I do want to talk about. Mars trine Saturn. Okay, Mars and Saturn together, I don't care what the aspect, it's not good. Okay, so let's just be frank here. You can't take two malefics and make it a positive, right? I mean, that's tough. Sure, it could be putting some actions towards certain structures, and we do have to do that, obviously, with the archives, because we keep having information being found by ex-presidents and vice presidents and things. So, yeah, some of the structures need some work. Also, that trine to Vesta. You know, Vesta is a distance, okay? And Saturn is like separations at a distance. But remember that it's the house of open enemies. There is a Mars trine Mercury, which does help us know everything, but I don't think it's really good information. The fact that Mars squares Neptune actually might be the best aspect of them all, okay? Mars squaring Jupiter, I don't think is going to benefit us much. I'll tell you what I'm talking right here. The semi-sesquitrad, or whatever you want to call it, to Venus is more of an obligatory and, kind of aspect, as would be this Pluto. And I do believe that this is true, that if we're going to move on and we're going to transform, we really got to look at these things. And we got to look at how money factors into everything. And by the way, the reason why that man got caught was because I believe it was an ex-girlfriend called up the DOJ to ask why he had so much bags of money. You see a lot of cash like that, you really should go ding, 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 because something ain't right. So apparently she did. Squaring the Aries point is not a surprise either. So here we go, because I don't think that these are just United States enemies. I think that they're enemies of other people in the world. Anyway, so you see that in this particular case of Mars, what we might have to go through these Mars, look at all these squares. I don't think it's bad. I think overall it's going to be good. Shocking, but I don't think bad. So I did want to point that out. The other thing that we'll do really quickly, and only because this is the beginning of the aspect itself, there we go, is let's go to Mars, which was, like we said, 25 something. Oh, let me do it this way, because then I'll go right to it. There it is. So 36 on this. But anyway, this kind of gives you an idea of all of the points that would be involved in this. And of course, if I were looking at this retrograde, I would probably go back in and I would then talk about the asteroids that would have fallen in those places. If you go back 2230, so it'd be about 3 really. I'll go 256. You see the midheaven sun is involved in that axis. In this particular chart, it would be more affiliated with what's happening in our area. But it is interesting that the sun got pulled into the axis through that midheaven. And then there's an ascendant sun, and look at the ascendant Vesta. So it brings back all those points when you go and you look at it. So it's really interesting to do that, and everybody should do that for their own areas or their own charts, really. And now we're looking at the next chart, which I called Jan, but it's really January 12th. And January 12th is when it leaves. So as it leaves, okay, I want to point this out. I liked this chart a lot, and you're going to find it. There's some things I'm going to point out in the next one as well. Okay, so here's our Mars, and you can't see it, but there's a red S. And an S is always going to be that thing, if you're using solar fire, that tells you if it's stationary, if it's retrograde, and it stations at the beginning, at the end of every retrograde. But that's not what's interesting about this chart. This chart features not only an Aries point sun, which is falling in, and this is January 12th, it's falling into the 11th house, which is the house of achievement of goals. It's also the house of association. Bing, 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 bing. And it is our goals, I think, to get to the bottom of what's been going on in our country. So that's really, that's good. But I liked this too. Look at this horizon. Right across. 0 degrees Pisces, 0 degrees of Virgo. Now, let's talk about that point, 0 degrees of Pisces, for just a second. The next chart we're going to talk about, not in the Mars sequence, but the next thing we're going to talk about is when Saturn goes into Aquarius. Okay, Saturn goes into Aquarius, and I've written down here, March 7th, around 8:30 in the morning. This time of 8:30, 8:35 in the morning is pretty big on these last couple of events too. Saturn moves into Pisces, and then you have to ask yourself, what is going on March 7th that might be related to January 12th? Because of that ascendant. Now, the ascendant does pass through it all the time, but at the moment that Saturn is leaving, Saturn's not leaving. Mars is leaving its retrograde motion. I like that. I happen to think that March is going to be a huge month. I happen to think that March, like some other psychics and astrologers, could be a snapshot for the next couple of decades. And that doesn't mean that we're going to see everything that's going to happen in that 20 years. It's just that it's going to mark like a moment that represents. Even though that Saturn, I know Pluto goes back once it hits Aquarius. No, I think it does stay in Pisces. I'd have to double check that. And I will before I actually do that chart. But for today, I just want to show you this. So let's look at that. Okay, so those are the two things on this. Oh, we can go to the dial. Now, this is a leaving of a retrograde, not usually something I would look at. It was just that the chart was so interesting. Now, right when it goes direct, stations, okay, it does so with the asteroid, and I did want to talk about this, Arachne. So on the 12th, Mars was with Arachne. How complicated was your life on January 12th? So I thought that was really interesting. Across the dial, we also have automobiles and vehicles, okay, or whatever you might use as a vehicle of expression, a vehicle of transportation. It's going to be complicated, or has been complicated on the 12th. So it's just really interesting how the 12th also has some interesting stuff going on. Now, since that is, that would be 8 degrees. So we go back 22 from 68. It would be, because 68 is what the real number would be. So you're going to be 46. So right about here. Okay. I'm going to go, actually, it's a little bit more, but that would be the actual Poseidon. I'm going to go there because I think that's a part of what's going on with this Mars retrograde. It has been enlightening, even for me, who has really suffered tremendously through this retrograde. Notice no videos could happen because I had to really reset this up. This was a real feat. And it's not even, the chart doesn't even look as good as the other one. But again, it is what it is. But it does mean that in this time period, there were a lot of things that, for example, I am getting a new computer. And since I am an Aquarius who has some things in early Aquarius, it's going to be a really good time for me to do it. So that is showing you then the Mars. Now, the last thing I want to show you on the Mars, because I want to stay in, is Mars 15th. And Mars 15th is the day that here we go. It's 25 degrees. Here it is. I knew it was over here around the second house. And when I did this chart, I did the morning, and it's not going to be in this morning. It's actually going to be somewhere between the 15th and the 16th that actually changed. So later in the day on the 15th. But you'll feel it, I believe. So I didn't go into it that much as I could have, but I do want to point this out. Okay, so look up here in Pisces where we have Neptune, the sun. That is a direct hit, nailing. Neptune sun is being nailed by that Mars, which is now completely out of its shadow. So I do think that we want to mark our calendars for March 15th, March 16th, because I do believe, and we could even know coming into it only because Mercury is right there, but it's a little bit ahead of the big square. And that big square is also pulling in Pluto if you go that far. So I just really feel it's going to be pretty good or pretty monumental. I hope good, but then there is no good, there is no bad. But monumental meaning we could hear something. So if I go to the dial and I pull up Mars, which is now way up here in the chart, it's running with chaos. No, I'm sorry, that's not chaos. That's actually the white moon, or Selena, if you'd like. And how about this? The midheaven of this chart, though. So again, it's going to be slightly different, or it's going to be right around that time for everybody, but it's going to be different in terms of timing for everyone, because depending on where you live, midheaven gets there, and then because of the clocks, and the timing. But look at that. I mean, I just want to say that Uranus, Apple, and I just think there's going to be a lot of things happening, a lot of changes, and midheaven and Mars and Neptune and Sun, and they're all together, and they equal this midheaven. And so it's really interesting in terms of a chart. If this were an individual, boy, I'd have a lot to tell them. But we're looking at this in terms of a chart. So even though you may not be affected by anything that you see in this chart, you could still make a note of the day. The day could still have some implications through news broadcasts and other things. The 12th had a lot in terms of that because of the Aries point. Now, just very briefly, because I've been talking, I want to show you just really quickly the two big charts I'm going to be really looking at in the next month or so. I just am so excited about it. The first one is that we're looking at our Saturn, look at it, at 0, 0, 0 in the 11th house again. Remember, we made note of that 11th house earlier with Mars. Now the 11th house is going to be housing Saturn, and Mercury's it's about 8 degrees away, and then the sun. But if you put Saturn, Mercury, and the sun together, then Mercury would be an exact midpoint of Saturn, Sun. So we're going to be getting news of something ending, something separating, something is going on March 7th. Okay, so look at that. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be. Now, we have the 11th house here in the United States, but trust me, I don't care if you're in Australia. I doubt that it's going to change that configuration of Mercury is the midpoint of the Sun, Saturn. And I use Australia because I think of them as like the other opposite end of the world. So anywhere in the world, okay? I think you're going to see it. I'm really excited. I'll get to this chart as we get closer. Probably within the next month, I would do it because I do like to do them beforehand. Before other people start doing them, I like to do mine. Only because I do listen to other videos and I really do not want to be influenced. Then the other chart we're going to be looking at in great detail, because this is the changing of almost an age. When you talk about Pluto moving into a different sign, Pluto's like a 20-year planet, okay? So we're looking at really a couple decades. And this March 23rd would be, even though it goes back and then it comes back in June, I got to be honest with you guys, we only do one ingress, the first one. This chart becomes monumental. And I do want to point out that once again, in this area, Saturn is on the midheaven. So, you know, the sun is off the Aries point, but only by 2 degrees. And so, again, such interesting charts. These planets are also moving at kind of, I want to say strange times, but I don't think it's strange. I think they're kind of monumental. So it'll be really interesting when we get there. But I did want to throw a video out there so that y'all know I'm still here. I'm well, I'm fine. Computers, not so much. But with that said, I'm going to let you go until we meet again. I wish you all only happy reading.